This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to How to Get Started with OneLogin Workforce Identity, Part 3. So now, let's look at how we can get our users to log in securely and simply to OneLogin. Remember those major steps. We finally completed step 1. Now we are on to step 2. Again, don't want the users logging in yet. Want to make sure they are logging in securely. So before we go into the specifics on how to control the user login process, let's take a look at the various options you have when it comes to actually authenticating the users. The easiest and simplest option is to have your users authenticated directly by OneLogin. Users that are created manually in OneLogin would have their authenticated by option set to OneLogin, as we can see here. And again, it's going to be the default option. The user then attempts to log into OneLogin, and OneLogin is going to confirm they have the correct credentials. Those credentials are stored in the OneLogin database. And of course, if the credentials are correct, the user is going to get in successfully. If a user is synced from something like Active Directory or even LDAP directory, then their authenticated by option would be set to whatever that directory connector is. This means then that when a user attempts to log into OneLogin, instead of OneLogin checking its database to confirm that user password, it's going to forward the authentication request through the directory connector. In the case of Active Directory, the Active Directory connector. And it's forwarding it through onto a domain controller that belongs to the Active Directory domain or forest that the user is logging into. Once that domain controller validates the authentication request and it's successful, then it's going to send an acknowledgement back to OneLogin, and voila, the user gets logged in. And again, same flow for LDAP. So user attempts to log into OneLogin. OneLogin confirms using that LDAP connector. LDAP says, yeah, I know it. They got the right credentials. Sends the acknowledgement back to OneLogin. And again, user allowed in. Finally, if you want those users to be authenticated by another type of external directory, such as Google Directory or Azure AD, then you might configure Google to be a trusted identity provider, right? So you're going to set up those new users to utilize a TIDP that you are configuring within OneLogin. Thus, then, user can log in possibly one of two ways. Somewhat kind of depends upon the authentication protocol that you're setting up with that trusted identity provider. SAML and OIDC would be your two options there. But login flow can work such that user logs into the TIDP and then they click on something like a tile that leads them to OneLogin. And OneLogin is going to allow them in because it trusts that identity provider. In this case, my example here, say, trusts Google. Because it trusts Google, Google says the user is okay. OneLogin allows the user in. Conversely, again, depending upon the TIDP and the authentication protocol utilized, user might go directly to OneLogin. Now, OneLogin knows that this user is configured to use an external trusted IDP. That's what we see there on that user's authentication tab. So OneLogin is going to forward the request to the external IDP. External IDP says they're okay. User is now allowed into OneLogin. So no matter what directory you configure your users to be authenticated by, still need to decide how to configure your users' security policies. So we actually have two types of security policies in OneLogin. We have user policies and app policies. User policies control how users log into OneLogin in terms of how secure that process is. So password complexity, whether MFA is required, whether they can only log in from certain IP addresses, things like that are defined within a user policy. App policies apply at the app connector level. They'll determine whether additional security requirements are necessary before a user can access the application. So do we want to prompt them for MFA again? Or maybe we allow them to log into the portal from anywhere, but when they access this particular application, they have to be logging in from a particular network. Our focus for this module is going to be on the user policies, because at the beginning of the implementation, we're focusing on getting our users into that portal securely. Every OneLogin account has a single user policy by default, and it is applied to all users by default. If you have the same security requirements in terms of how you want your users to log into the platform, then you can simply modify the default policy. If you have different sets of users that you want different settings to apply to, for example, some users maybe are going to use a YubiKey to log in and others can use an app on their phone like OneLogin Protect, then you can create separate policies and apply them to the separate sets of users. We'll talk about how to automate this process later on in this module. So different types of settings on the security policy will apply at different stages within the login process. For example, a new user might be sent a password reset email to create their password. The user policy will determine how long that password has to be or how complex it needs to be. It can even compare that password to lists of compromised passwords and prevent the user from setting their password to one that is available on the dark web and used for breach attacks. This would be our compromised credential check, which is part of SmartFactor Authentication. The user policy can also require that the user register an additional authentication factor such as OneLogin Protect when they first log in, and force them to use it in addition to their password for every subsequent login. So now we have a login process that requires a username, password, and an additional authentication factor, like the one-time password, which OneLogin Protect can generate. Once the user gets past these hurdles, the user policy can also require that the login attempt is coming from, say, a specific range of IP addresses, meaning the user has to be on a particular network in order to connect. Maybe it's the internal network, or they at least need to be connected to that network via VPN. If the user passes all these tests that are configured as part of their user policy, then they're let in. Finally, they might have session timeout settings that are also defined within the secure policy. Session timeout settings only kick in once they've actually logged into the portal. And they can, of course, determine whether a user will automatically be logged out, say 2 hours after they first log in, so they're forced to log in again. Or they could be based upon simply inactivity, like the user hasn't interacted with the portal in 2 hours. Then they get logged out. You can start off by either selecting again that default policy and modifying it, and you will find it underneath the security menu under policies, or create new user policies to fit your organization's needs. And again, go to the security menu policies and click on the button that says New User Policy. So let's go modify an existing default user policy and change, say, password complexity requirements and timeout settings. Again, we're going to find those user policies underneath our security menu, policies, and here's our default. Remember, we had created an admin user policy in our first module because we wanted to make sure that all our administrators were logging in using MFA. If you want all of your users to have particular settings and not necessarily create separate policies for different subsets of users, then the easiest thing to do, of course, is modify the default policy. So for this one, we'll just check out, maybe some of these password complexity requirements, maybe reset their password every 60 days, but require upper, lower case and digits when it comes to the passwords that they utilize. And go over here to session, maximum invalid login attempts. Maybe we'll lower that one down to 3 minutes and say they're going to automatically be logged out after, let's do it in terms of hours, maybe 4 hours. So they log in at 8 a.m. in the morning. They will automatically be logged out at noon and have to provide authentication methods again. And we will save our changes here. So by default, again, this will apply to all of our current users. If I go to their authentication tab, we can see user security policy is, by default, the default policy. Okay. Implementing multi-factor authentication, MFA, which is requiring more than one authentication factor when users log in, is one of the major steps you can take in order to ensure that your users are logging in securely. You can easily require users to provide additional authentication factors when they log in by modifying the settings on the MFA tab of your user policy. Most of the options available will be listed under one-time passwords. Though, before you see anything listed here, you have to add auth factors you want them to be able to choose from first. Once you add in the auth factors, simply check the OTP auth required checkbox and check the auth factors you want them to be able to use or choose from. You will then need to decide how they're going to register these auth factors. Will they be forced to do so when they first log in? Will they have the option to do so? Or will they be able to do so only from their profile page once they've logged in? If you want to require MFA, the first option, requiring them to register their MFA devices when they first log in, is usually your best option. In addition to the auth factors, you can then check off under the one-time password section on the MFA tab. You can also require that your users have certificates installed on their machines. These certificates can simply be pushed out to or downloaded to systems as part of your user setup process, or you can additionally license OneLogin Desktop, and it installs a certificate that is used for authentication as part of its installation process. Any system that has one of these certs installed is considered a trusted device. So to enable this, you would check the checkbox saying device trust required. And those other MFA options, the ones you see underneath one-time password section, those you would add in, again, under the security menu, but this time choose authentication factors and click the new auth factor button. Then just choose which one you want. OneLogin, of course, provides quite a few options on its own. Most notably, OneLogin Protect, which can generate a new one-time password or OTP every 30 seconds before being placed with a new one-time password. It also works with push notifications that you can accept or deny from the lock screen. You can even require your users to use biometrics from their phone in order to accept those push notifications. So, before we can require MFA, let's add in at least one additional auth factor. So where are we going to find those authentication factors? Again, underneath that security menu, authentication factors. Again, we already actually have OneLogin Protect added here. Did that previous module when we wanted to make sure administrators were logging in using an additional authentication factor. Add in any other options. Just click on that new auth factor button up there. Go and choose the option that you want. So, maybe SMS, maybe email, maybe even have some third-party options that you want to support, like YubiKey over here. So in this case, let's go and choose WebAuthn and say save. So now we have a couple of options to choose from. Now we can go through and require MFA as we discussed before. Check the OTP auth required checkbox. Check off the factor or factors we want to give to our users. And finally, just leave that default. Users without an MFA device must register one before they're able to log in. Once you've decided to require MFA and then added and chosen the authentication factors you want to make available, it's important to note that these settings by default actually only apply to administrators when they log in. The reason for this is you want to make sure you've tested this process and had time to communicate and possibly train your users before you mistakenly force it on them all at once. Once you're ready for all your users to use MFA, you can change the OTP required for setting to all users or to just those that have their MFA device already registered. So let's go enable it and see what our users might experience. All right, so let's enable MFA for all of our users. So we'll just modify the default user policy over here. Going to go to the MFA tab, say OTP auth is required, OneLogin Protect. Now, by default, it is going to prompt our users to register their MFA when they first log in. That's what we want. And what we are going to set up, we're going to assume that we've already tested this, so we don't need the training wheels on with this administrator only option, and we're going to switch it to all users. So now all users, when they log in, will be prompted to register MFA first, and then every subsequent login will require the MFA. So let's go test it out. I'm going to test it out for my friend, Mr. Firewall. I amuse myself with my names. And click continue here. I'm going to type in a password for him. Click continue, and it is asking us to begin setup. So first thing, obviously, want to make sure that OneLogin Protect is installed on our phone. We have already downloaded it, so it's already installed on the phone. At this point, what we need to do is click on that little plus button, and we are going to activate. So just scan. QR code there. It was happy with the scan. I do not want to save my password in the browser. That is not safe. And now I am logged in as Mr. Fire.wall there. And I was prompted. So I'm set up. Every subsequent login, again, Firewall will be prompted to provide OneLogin Protect. One of the most common add-ons we see customers purchase is SmartFactor Authentication. And one of the main reasons they're interested in SmartFactor is because it enables adaptive authentication. I'm not going to go into detail about everything that SmartFactor enables, but it is important to note that it is more than just adaptive authentication. First, it includes smart flows, which give you the ability to change the order in which users are authenticated. For example, you could choose passwordless flows, which don't even prompt for passwords and only prompt for MFA. Or you could choose brute force, which prompts for MFA before it prompts for passwords. SmartFactor also includes dynamic password blacklist and compromised credential check. These can control what passwords users can use based on either preventing them from using particular words or even using passwords that have already been compromised through breaches of other systems. The two parts of SmartFactor that provide adaptive authentication are Smart Access and Smart MFA. And these are the ones we're going to be focusing on for this particular course. The last part of SmartFactor is called Smart Hooks, and it provides a low-code way for you to customize how your OneLogin account behaves. For example, you can customize a user's authentication process by maybe changing up how they're being authenticated depending upon what type of system they're logging in from. So again, SmartFactor Authentication provides adaptive authentication. First, look at Smart Access, which is enabled at the top of the MFA tab and only shows up if you have SmartFactor enabled. Smart Access looks at a user's login context, the time of day they're logging in, where they're located, the device they're logging in from, the browser they're using, etc. This information is gathered over time and used to develop a profile of a user's typical login behavior. Then, with Smart Access enabled, if that behavior is drastically different from the user's normal login behavior, the login attempt will be denied. Smart MFA looks at a user's login behavior and compares it to their typical login behavior as well. With Smart MFA, however, if the user's login behavior is similar to their normal login behavior, it's actually considered a valid authentication factor. Like their behavior itself is considered an authentication factor. And the user might not be prompted for an additional authentication factor. So if you had maybe like OneLogin Protect normally required for them, if the user's behavior is similar to their normal behavior, they won't be prompted for OneLogin Protect. We'll consider that behavior to be a valid authentication factor and let them in after, say, they provided their password. If the behavior is much different than their normal behavior, then they will be provided for that additional authentication factor, like OneLogin Protect. Both of these features are making decisions off of what is known as a risk score. And that risk score is assigned to each login event for the user. The closer the login behavior is to the user's norm, the lower the risk score. So you can think of the risk score as a number that's assigned to them from, say, 0 to 100. When a user first logs in, they're going to get a good high risk score, something closer to 100, almost 100 usually, because we don't know what their normal behavior is. As they continue to log in and the system learns their normal behavior and sort of establishes that pattern of behavior, the closer the behavior is to that norm, the lower the risk score. So if I log in every morning at 9 a.m. from San Francisco, California, using my Mac, and I'm using Chrome, then eventually my risk score will start showing up from like 0. And if I have Smart MFA enabled, like you see down there at the bottom, and my risk level is set to minimal, I will no longer be prompted for my additional authentication factor, like OneLogin Protect. If I go out of town, fly off to Jamaica, and for some reason I'm doing work down there, I log in at 1 a.m., I'm now in a totally different location. I'm logging in at a weird time. My risk score doesn't necessarily jump all the way to 100, however, because I'm still logging in from the same machine, still using the same browser. So my risk score will jump above maybe that minimal level, so I'll be prompted for my MFA. As long as I'm able to provide it, I can get in. If we have Smart Access enabled, depending upon what that risk level is set into, I might actually be blocked when I try to log in from Jamaica. So usually Smart Access kind of set to the high level. So what we're really preventing is not me being in Jamaica trying to do work, not preventing me from logging in from there. What we're preventing is somebody who somehow got a hold of my credentials trying to log in from Russia or some place that I'm totally not likely to go to, perhaps. And they're logging from not only, totally different location, but from a different machine, using different browser, different time of day. So all the behaviors are looking very different from my norm. Thus, that risk score is much closer to 100, and we can just prevent the login attempt. So let's actually take a look at how MFA can work. We'll create a new policy, apply it to a user manually, log in a couple different places, and we can actually see that risk score within the event data. All right, so now let's go first create a new policy. We're going to go play with some Smart MFA settings here. So we're going to call this Smart MFA policy. And over on MFA, we're going to require OTP and make sure it's enabled for all of our users. We're going to go down here towards the bottom. So again, only if we bought SmartFactor will we see this, but we're going to suppress the risk. And we'll leave it at the minimal. We've got several options here. So again, a risk score is what it's going to start generating every time my user logs in. The higher the risk score, basically, the less like normal activity will be that login behavior. So meaning, again, user logs in 9 a.m. from San Francisco, California, using a Mac, logging in from Chrome, and they do that day after day. Their risk score is very low every time they're logging in with those behaviors. So risk scores range from about 100 to 0. So every time they're logging in, showing that same behavior, risk score gets closer and closer to 0, which minimal is like 5 or less. When they do something outside that norm, log in from a different browser, different machine, different time of day, the risk score will increase. So idea is when the risk score is low, then we're looking at that behavior again as that secondary authentication factor, basically. So we're going to set that up for this particular policy. Now let's go torture Mr. Firewall. And we're going to go apply the policy directly to him. So choose Smart MFA over here and click Save. Now it's going to be hard to control because, again, it's based upon learning over time. And we've just enabled Mr. Firewall. But we can at least log in as him and take a look at what his risk scores are. And then maybe log in as him a couple of times to see how that risk score might change over time. We can actually view the risk score through our event activity. So we'll login as him, and he does have OneLogin Protect is required here, so we are going to accept the push notification, and voila. Please do not say that password. He's been logged in. So meanwhile, let's go back and as an administrator, go check out when he was logged in, and we can go and see his risk score. Actually, you can see it's 50 out of 100. Cool. So far, again, kind of infrequent access for him. Well, because he's only just started logging in, so that makes sense. So why don't we try it again? Let's go log out, see if it makes any difference. Again, it might take a few times for that system to learn. So, oops, not fur, but firewall at demo.com. Type in his password. I'm not going to say the password out loud. That would be bad. Again, we are going to be prompted for OTP. We are providing it. And voila, we are in. Okay, so let's go see if it made any difference. Again, no guarantees, but kind of fun to see if maybe it lowered a little bit. I did. Notice. Now we're down to 32. Okay. So let's tweak this a little bit. I have a feeling we're going to hit below maybe 25 for the next one. So let's change it maybe from minimal, which is 5 or less. That's going to take quite a few more logins to get that low. So let's maybe change it to low. Here, let's see what happens. We'll click save. Again, policy's already applied to him, so I don't have to do anything else other than make that one modification. Let us go again. Log out. And Mr. Firewall. Logging in. And we're being prompted for OneLogin Protect again. That's fine. Let's go see what the score got to. I should have probably clicked on never for this site. But let's go back over. Go to our events. Oh, we're so close. It was 26. All right, let's try one more time because I really, really want to see it be suppressed. And go back over here. We're going to log out as him. And one time more. Oops. This would be so much faster if I didn't keep fat fingering things. There we go. And of course, now I mistyped the password. Firewall demo, okay. Crossing our fingers, and voila! He is in without having to provide OneLogin Protect or that additional authentication factor. And why is that? Well, because if we go and refresh over here, we can see that his score was a 20. So it was less than that lower level, which is basically like 25 or less, and voila, MFA was suppressed. And that is smart MFA at work again, because that risk level was set to low. This concludes part 3 of how to get started with OneLogin Workforce Identity. Please continue on to part 4.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.